Hi students, it's Mrs. Delorier, Assistant Principal at Linda. Today I'm going to read you some stories about some famous women in science. So these are some women that were fearless pioneers who changed the world. So they were the first to do whatever it is that they studied. So it's a really interesting book, and there's a lot of really good stories about certain um, occupations that you may never have heard of. So the first woman that I'm going to read to you about is a lady named Maria Sibylla Merian. Okay, so she was a scientific illustrator and entomologist, which is someone that studies bugs, and she actually drew the artwork for her book. She was born in Germany in 1647, and she combined science and art to become one of the greatest scientific illustrators of all time. In the 1600s, Europeans did not have a basic understanding of insects, and most people thought that they were simply disgusting and not worth study. So Maria could not have disagreed more. At a young age, she started collecting insects to study how they behaved. Her stepfather taught her how to use paint, which she used to illustrate the different stages of her favorite insects' lives. She was particularly interested in butterflies, and at that time, no one really understood the connection between caterpillars and butterflies, so she went ahead and studied it. And in 1679, she published a book on metamorphosis, and she filled it with scientific notes and illustrations. And then Maria kind of left. She went to Holland for a little while. And finally, at age 52, she braved the rainforests of South America, and she documented never before seen bugs in the face of dangerous rain and heat. Unfortunately, her trip ended early. She got malaria, which is a disease, and but she had already made all the illustrations that she needed, so she was able to still publish a really, really famous book called The Metamorphosis of the Insects, and it became a hit all over Europe in 1705, a long time ago. Maria's work helped future scientists to classify and understand insects, and her beautiful, detailed illustrations, they still amaze people to this day. So that's a little bit about Maria. And if you go ahead and check this book out or look for it online, you can see many more stories about other women in science. So I'm going to read you a story about another lady that I think is amazing, Elizabeth Blackwell. She was a doctor. She had no interest in medicine until one of her friends actually died from cancer, and she was very curious about it. And she decided that if there was a female doctor, then this doctor would have been able to save her. So she decided to become the first woman medical doctor in the United States. So she was born into a family of abolitionists in 1821, which were people that were against slavery. And so her upbringing, they valued justice and they valued equality. So while she was working as a school teacher, she was mentored by a male doctor friend and read books about all their medical libraries. But many didn't believe it was possible. Finally, she was accepted into Geneva Medical College, so it's pretty impressive. Medical school was really hard for any student, but Elizabeth faced additional challenges. She was often met with hostility, which means that people were kind of against her being there because she was a woman. She had to sit separately from the male students, and her teachers were embarrassed when she was there during their lessons, mainly because they were kind of talking about the human body, and they were uncomfortable that this girl was sitting in their room. When asked to leave a lecture about like women and men's bodies, she argued and said, I want to stay. I want to learn about this. And during the summer, she worked in a hospital in Philadelphia, and she saw how the hospital conditions contributed to the spread of infectious disease. What does that mean? It means the way that the hospital was set up, or the way that it was cleaned, or the way that it was cared for was actually causing other people to get sick because there just wasn't a healthy practice in that hospital. So this experience inspired her to write a thesis, which is like a really long paper that kind of gives her theory on things. And she said that she could prevent all these sicknesses if they had better hygiene, which means cleanliness, right? So in 1849, she graduated from Geneva Medical College. She was first in her class. And her sister, Emily, also became a doctor. And together with a third woman doctor, they opened the New York Infirmary for Indigent Women and Children in 1857. So it was a place for the poor to get treatment from female medical students and nurses and for all of them to learn. In the 1800s, there was little known about communicable diseases, and they didn't understand this. But now they realize that hand washing is so important, and it wasn't mandatory for the doctors. The doctors didn't have to wash their hands when they were treating patients. So obviously, people were getting sick. So, because of this, it was very common for doctors to go straight from treating one person, like with the flu, to delivering a baby without even washing their hands. So, it caused the spread of disease, and Elizabeth realized that the prevention was better than the cure. And you might have heard that before, but basically, preparing yourself for something or causing it to not happen is better than having to try to get rid of it after it was there. Sounds like some things we're going through these days as well. In her lecture, she advocated for better hygiene standards in medical hospitals and in homes. She went on to found the Women's Medical College of New York in 1868 and the London School of Medicine for Women in 1874. So she was a super big inspiration to many women. She also made it possible for many of those women to become doctors. So that's a pretty impressive story about Elizabeth Blackwell. I'll show you a couple of pictures. They kind of have little stories in this book, little snippets, little pictures that you can read if you want to look at this book. Florence Baskin is a geologist and an educator, and maybe you don't know what a geologist does, but a geologist is someone that studies rocks and the earth, and so we're going to learn about that. So Florence Baskin was born in Massachusetts in 1862, and her father always encouraged her to, study and be in school. And they were on a road trip, and he and his other friend, who was a geologist, it inspired her and it interested her, and she started wanting to study rocks. So in 1893, Florence was the first woman to get a PhD from Johns Hopkins University, and it didn't come easy. She was forced to take her classes behind a screen so she wouldn't distract any of the male classmates. Despite the unfair treatment she received, she still loved to learn, and she became the second woman in America to complete a geology doctorate. So she was a doctor of geology. So there's a difference between something called an MD, which is a medical doctor, which is something that allows you to practice medicine, and then a PhD, which means you have a doctor in something else. So she has a doctorate in geology, so she knows more than almost anybody all about rocks. So that's kind of cool. So Florence became an authority on rocks and how to categorize them through chemical makeup and mineral content. So what the rocks had in them and kind of the minerals that were in them, and that's how she classified them. And by studying the layers of rocks, it helps us get a better understanding of history and the evolution of our planet's surface. In her dissertation, that's kind of like the last thing you have to go through to get that PhD. Florence's expertise allowed her to prove that a layer of rock everyone had thought was sedimentary was actually caused by lava flows. So sedimentary is kind of like layering, and she's saying, this actually happened because there was a volcano. So she gave that speech and that talk to the other geologists, and that's the ultimate last paper that she had to do to prove herself to get her PhD. So she began teaching and researching at Bryn Mawr College in 1895, and she founded the geology program, and her curriculum was one of the most highly regarded in the nation. She trained almost every female geologist in America until she retired in 1928. Working in a women's college gave Florence research opportunities she may not have otherwise had. She was a rigorous teacher, but she was also able to do important field work for the U.S. Geological Survey. At Bryn Mawr, she began her intensive work in geomorphology, the study of how the Earth's geography changes over thousands and thousands of years. So Florence's research focused on the hilly area of the Appalachians, some people call them the Appalachians, also known as the Mid-Atlantic Piedmont. She created important geographical maps of New Jersey and Pennsylvania, and they're still used today. So Florence Baskin rocked the world of geology. Her discoveries and maps continue to influence the field. So that's pretty cool. You can study about her. Maybe you're interested in rocks or geology, and maybe you didn't even know you could have a career out of it. So one of my favorite people that we're going to read about is Marie Curie. She was a physicist and a chemist. chemist. Marie Curie, it's so hard to say her name, was born in Warsaw, Poland, okay, in 1867. And after working as a governess to support her sister's education, it was Marie's turn. She traveled to Paris to study, where she met Pierre Curie, a fellow scientist, and her greatest love. Becquerel, I think his name is, he discovered a mysterious glow coming from uranium or uranium salts. And scientists didn't seem too interested in the effect, but Marie was very fascinated and wanted to know what was happening and why it was glowing. In a stuffy shed, Marie and Pierre, her husband, went to work. Using Pierre's electrometer, Marie examined glowing compounds and discovered that the energy being produced came from the uranium atom itself. We now know that atoms with an unstable nucleus emit particles and release energy. You might be studying that in science. Marie started calling the effect radioactivity. Have you ever heard that word before? Pretty cool that Marie Curie studied and figured that out. To find the source, she and Pierre ground up and filtered down other radioactive materials like the mineral ore in other minerals. Through this process, Pierre and Marie discovered two new radioactive elements, and together they received a Nobel Prize in Physics in 1903 for the discovery of radiation. Later in 1911, Marie won a second Nobel Prize in Chemistry for her discovery of the research into those two new elements. Pierre and Marie made an amazing team. Sadly, they realized that the radiation from their experiments was actually making them sick, and that's what we know about radiation today. You can't really have too much of it in your body. It's not good for you. So Pierre would do tests with radium on his own arm, and he actually got burns. And they determined that long-term exposure made them both very tired and achy, and now we actually understand that it's kind of poisoning your body. In 1906, Pierre was killed in a horse carriage accident, not even studying uranium and all this radiation. Despite her grief and the danger involved, Marie decided she was going to continue her important work, and she actually discovered that radium could be used as a cancer treatment. She spent hours collecting radon gas and sending it to hospitals, even though it left her feeling weak. So she actually collected this to use to help other cancer patients because she was so sad about the loss of her husband. She knew her work and her studying was super important. In 1914, France was invaded during World War I, and with her daughter, she created a unit of mobile medical X-ray trucks, which they drove into the battlefields to actually help the wounded soldiers. Oh my gosh, so amazing. Marie Curie did scientific work because she loved it, and even though it was dangerous, she knew the world needed it. Her life and work continue to inspire other scientists today. So very cool. So you can learn more about Marie Curie if you go ahead and Google her. You can learn a little bit more about other famous women. So I'm going to give you a little timeline. And this timeline just kind of has some stories about kind of women and history. So I'm going to go ahead and tell you throughout history, many obstacles have stood in the way of women who pursued the sciences. A lack of access to higher education and not being paid a fair wage are some of those barriers. But we want to celebrate some of those milestones in history and the accomplishments women have made in education and science. So in 1400 AD, so we're going to start right here, we have Hypatia, is that how you pronounce her name? We're going to have to ask one of the sixth grade teachers. They would know better than me. Hypatia of Alexandria was the first recorded female mathematician. How cool is that? In 1678, Elena Piscopia was the first woman in the world to receive a doctoral degree. Pretty cool. And Sibylla Masters was the first woman in the United States to get a patent for her own invention, which cleaned and processed corn. That was in 1715. In the 1780s, Caroline Herschel, she was an astronomer. She became the first woman to become an honorary member of the Royal Society. Pretty cool. The first college for women, the first college to admit women was in 1833. Oberlin College was the first one to let women into their university. In 1903 was when Marie Curie won that first Nobel Prize for a woman. A woman had not received a Nobel Prize until that point. And in 1920, women gained the right to vote in the United States. That's the 19th Amendment. That's what allowed women to vote in 1920. Can you believe how long it took for women to be able to get the right to vote? Crazy. In 1941 to 1945, World War II created a new workforce of women while men were at war. Female scientists were given new opportunities to show their talents. So when a lot of the men went off to war, a lot of the women took those jobs normally held by men. So it was pretty cool that they could show what they could do. In 1946, an all-female team programmed the first all-electronic computer with the Electronic Numerical Integrator and Computer Project. Crazy. ENIAC was the project that they called, and that it was an all-female team. In 1947, Marie Daly became the first African-American woman to earn a PhD in chemistry. That's pretty cool. So that's over here in 1947. And then we've got a couple other things. In 1963, Valentina Tereshkova was the first woman in space. How awesome is that? The Equal Pay Act was passed in 1963 in America, and it stipulated that men and women should be paid equally for equal work. This law helps women to overcome the wage gap. Okay, so they're still fighting that gap. It's still not perfect, but in 1963, the Equal Pay Act was created. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act made many forms of discrimination illegal, ending racial segregation in schools and workplaces and giving more opportunities to African Americans. So that's awesome. 1964. Actually, not a very long time ago, really, considering. And now more women than before are working hard to invent, discover, and explore the unknown. And you can be one of those people. So this timeline is really inspiring. It really shows the progress that has come over the years for women. So learn more about women in science. If you'd like to read this book, you can stop by my office. You can check it out. You can look for it on Amazon. And we'll see if maybe even Miss Tucker can get us a copy in the library at Linda. All right. See you soon.